Your grandmother remembers everything. She remembers where the river bends just before the valley opens up. She remembers which berries made two children sick 14 winters ago. She remembers the sound the sky makes before a storm that has no clouds yet. For most of human history, that memory was the difference between your group surviving and not. We have been telling ourselves a story about old age in the prehistoric world that is almost entirely wrong. The story goes something like this. Life was brutal and short. The weak were left behind, and anyone who could not hunt or gather was a burden the group could not afford. It is a tidy story. It is also, according to the archaeological and anthropological evidence, largely a myth. So what actually happened to old people in the world your ancestors built? The answer is stranger, more tender, and more human than almost anyone expects. To understand it, you first need to recalibrate what old even meant in that world. Paleoanthropologist Rachel Kaspari of Central Michigan University spent years analyzing fossil dental records from across the last 200,000 years of human prehistory. What she found was striking. For most of early human history, very few individuals lived long enough to become grandparents. A significant jump in elder survival, what Kaspari and her colleague Sang-Hee Lee called the grandparent revolution, appears in the archaeological record beginning around 30,000 years ago. Suddenly, the ratio of older adults to younger adults in human groups more than doubled, and the groups where this happened thrived. This was not a coincidence. Before we go further, it is worth asking what old actually looked like for an ancient human. Skeletal analysis of individuals from Paleolithic sites across Europe and Africa suggests that by the age of 35 to 40, a person was considered genuinely old. Their teeth would show significant wear. Their joints would carry the accumulated damage of a life spent crouching, climbing, carrying, and walking on uneven ground. Their spine would compress under the weight of decades of physical work. But worn teeth and aching joints did not mean useless. At Sungir in Russia, the same site that preserved those extraordinary bead-covered children, archaeologists found the burial of an older adult male, dating back around 34,000 years. This individual showed signs of severe physical limitations, including a healed but damaging leg injury that would have made walking painful and hunting essentially impossible for years. Yet this person was buried with extraordinary care, accompanied by grave goods of ivory, ochre, and carved animal figures. The effort and materials invested in that burial tell us something clear. This person mattered. The group chose to carry them, feed them, and mourn them with ceremony. That is not how you treat a burden. The clearest evidence for what old people actually contributed comes from the anthropological study of living hunter-gatherer populations. In the early 2000s, anthropologist Kristen Hawkes of the University of Utah spent years studying the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last fully nomadic hunter-gatherer societies on Earth. What she observed upended conventional thinking about elder survival. Hadza grandmothers, past the age of reproduction and often unable to participate in the most physically demanding foraging tasks, were among the hardest workers in the entire group. They dug tubers from rocky ground when younger adults were away hunting. They processed food for hours each day. They fed grandchildren directly, freeing up younger mothers to nurse infants and gather more food. Hawkes measured the caloric contribution of these older women carefully. She found that a grandmother's daily food output often exceeded that of women half her age. This became the foundation of what is now called the grandmother hypothesis, one of the most influential theories in modern evolutionary anthropology. The idea, developed further by researchers like James O'Connell and Nicholas Blurton-Jones, is that the unusual length of human post-reproductive life, which is nearly unique in the animal kingdom, exists precisely because grandmothers were so valuable. They kept children alive. Their presence allowed human females to reproduce more frequently than would otherwise have been possible. They were, in a very literal sense, an evolutionary advantage. Your ancestors did not just tolerate old people. They built survival systems around them. But elders contributed something that calorie counts cannot capture. Think about what 30 or 40 years of living in a specific landscape actually produces in a human mind. You know this terrain the way no younger person can. You have watched the mammoth herds shift their routes after a drought. You remember the winter 20 years ago when the usual river crossing became impassable and the group had to detour 3 days east to find safe ground. You were there when a new tool method was tried and failed and then tried again with a small modification that made it work. That knowledge is irreplaceable. Anthropologist Kim Sterelny has written extensively about what he calls the knowledge ecology of small human groups, the invisible infrastructure of accumulated skill and memory that allowed prehistoric communities to survive conditions that would destroy a group of equally strong but inexperienced people. Elder members were the living library of that ecology. They held the contingency plans. They knew what to do when the plan failed. Archaeological evidence supports this directly. At sites like Pinnacle Point in South Africa, researchers have found evidence of highly complex tool-making traditions that required years of apprenticeship and instruction to master. The transmission of these skills across generations, from elder to younger hands, created a ratcheting effect on human technology. Each generation began where the last left off rather than starting over. Without elders to serve as teachers, that ratchet slips backward. Polly Wiesner, an anthropologist who has spent decades studying the Wok Kung San people of the Kalahari Desert, documented something else that elders provided that is rarely discussed in survival terms: firelight conversations. In her research, Wiesner found that daytime talk among the Bardi Kung focused heavily on practical matters: food, resources, logistics. But at night, around the fire, the conversation shifted dramatically. Stories dominated. Stories of distant places, of ancestors, of the moral lessons embedded in the history of the group. And it was overwhelmingly the elders who told them. These were not simply entertainment. Those stories encoded the group's accumulated wisdom about the world in a form that could survive in human memory for generations. They were the mechanism by which values, warnings, ecological knowledge, and social rules were transmitted without writing, without books, without anything except a fire and an elder who remembered. Consider what that elder was actually providing in that moment: a map of places they would never visit again, a record of decisions made in crises that no one present had lived through, a framework for understanding the world that had been tested over decades of real consequences. Now let us reconstruct a single moment, somewhere in what is now southern Europe, roughly 30,000 years ago. The group has been camped in this valley for 12 days. The hunting has been thin. 2 of the younger adults want to move north toward a ridge where they spotted animal tracks 3 days ago. 2 others want to stay near the river. The argument has stalled. An older woman, perhaps 50 years old, which in this world would make her among the most senior people alive, has said very little. She has been processing hides near the fire, her hands moving with the automatic efficiency of someone who has done this for 30 years. Now she looks up. She remembers a winter, 32 years ago, when another group tried the northern ridge in a year like this one. She does not know why she was the one who survived that winter. She does not say this. What she says is, "The ridge gives nothing in the cold. Stay near water." The group stays. The hunting improves by the 5th day. This moment happened. Not exactly like this, not in this valley, not with these words. But versions of this moment happened tens of thousands of times across the long human story. The elder's memory, costly to maintain and difficult to acquire, justified the cost of every meal the group had fed her for years. There is a final layer to this story that is perhaps the most quietly devastating. We know from the skeletal record that prehistoric communities did not simply tolerate their elders. They healed them. The Shanidar Cave Neanderthal, found in Iraq and dating back 65,000 years, survived for decades with a withered arm, partial blindness, and bone degeneration that would have made independent survival impossible. He was fed, he was kept warm, he was not abandoned. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, archaeologists found the remains of an elderly Neanderthal male who had lost nearly all of his teeth and showed advanced arthritis throughout his skeleton. He could not have chewed tough raw food. He could not have walked long distances, yet he survived to old age. Someone softened his food. Someone carried his weight. Researchers Lorna Tilley and Mark Oxenham, who study what they call the bioarchaeology of care, have cataloged dozens of such cases across the prehistoric record. People with conditions that required sustained nursing, with injuries that demanded long recovery, with degenerative diseases that made self-sufficiency impossible, surviving sometimes for years in the care of their group. The prehistoric world was not tender because it was easy. It was tender because survival itself required tenderness. Because that old woman who knew where the river bent, who remembered which berries were poison, who told stories by the fire about decisions made before anyone present was born, she was not a passenger. She was the navigator. You grew up in a world that tends to move its elders to the edges of things, to separate them into different buildings, different schedules, different lives. This is new, extraordinarily new. For 300,000 years, the oldest person in your group was also, in every practical sense, the most valuable. Your grandmother remembers everything. For most of human history, that memory did not just comfort the people around her, it kept them alive.